Hello again, and welcome back to the Cities Climate Action Summit 2023, hosted by Smart Cities World. Great to have you for our next panel discussion here on the commitments that cities may be looking for from central government as they strive to tackle the climate crisis. We're just coming in off the back of our last fireside chat, which was on the theme of technology deployment in cities and the role of connected technologies in climate change. If you've missed that, feel free to go back and watch it on demand over the next couple of days, as with anything else that you might have missed from earlier on in the day as well. I'm Luke, I'm your host for the summit, but those of you who have been watching live will probably be sick of me by now. So you'll be relieved to know I'm not your moderator for this session. That pleasure goes to Sandra Bear, who is our brand ambassador here at Smart Cities World, as well as CEO of Personal Cities, her own company. So Sandra, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce us to the rest of the panel and get started.
Thank you, Luke. Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited about this particular panel. In fact, the whole day has been filled with really smart people giving smart ideas and smart action recommendations. So I think you'll hear more of that in this session as well. Today, three really good panelists are here to talk about, as Luke mentioned, what is the role of the central government, the national government, the federal government, depending on which country you live in really supporting climate change initiatives. And we have three great panelists. I'll start with Christina Connolly. Christina is the Chief Operating Officer in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I must say that John Mitchell, who's the mayor, was also going to participate, but had a conflict. So we're so lucky that Christina can come in and give us some of the same stories and same ideas about what's going on in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Just as way of introduction, Christina, I guess I've known Mayor Mitchell for many years, and I felt like it was one of the cities in the United States leading the way with solar energy, wind energy. I mean, it's remarkable that a city with a good leadership, such as Mayor Mitchell, could really make a difference and be a leader for cities around the U.S. So Christina will give us some ideas about that. Next, I want to introduce James Nolan. James is the Executive Director for Environment and Climate in the City of Toronto. So impressed with some of the actions that Toronto is taking, whether it's electric vehicles or climate preparedness, action plans, et cetera. James, I can't wait to hear your story. And finally, Angel Sue, who is the co-lead for Net Zero Tracker. I consider you a real climatologist. We need more of those people in the world, Angel, so it'll be really great to hear your story and what you're doing physically located in the state of North Carolina, but I think really looking more globally at some of these climate actions. So let's start with Christina. Can you elaborate a bit more on what your role is and where you see New Bedford sort of taking charge and leading some climate action initiatives, especially related to any help that you've gotten from the federal government in the U.S.?
So I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the city. New Bedford is a city of about 101,000. We just cracked the 100,000 mark again after many decades in the 2020 census. I have a number of operating departments under my purview, one of which is the department directly responsible for coordinating our environmental responses, including hazardous waste sites and Superfund sites and brownfields. But the other side of their portfolio is resilience. So we renamed it the Department of Resilience and Environmental Stewardship a few years ago, emphasizing the resilience aspect, but we do still do a lot of the sort of day-to-day monitoring of spills and various events, and also monitoring brownfields and legacy issues from our industrial past. So my role is really as kind of leadership supervision of a number of, as I said, of operating departments. So, and the Department of Resilience and Environmental Stewardship itself is responsible for coordinating and facilitating collaboration among other city departments and outside actors in our climate response, and most notably took the lead in developing NB Resilient, which is our really robust and detailed climate action plan that was released. I think it was 2019, but with kind of pandemic years, I forget sometimes. Some of those years blur together.
Well, the NB Resilient plan that I looked at was dated 2021, so I feel like you're sort of constantly updating it and making new changes. Yeah. But thanks for that intro. We'll come back with some specific questions. James, why don't you tell us about the work you're leading in Toronto and your commitment to addressing the climate crisis?
Great. Thanks, Sandra, and really happy to be here today. So thank you to Luke and everyone for the invitation at Smart Cities World. So my role as the Executive Director of the Environment and Climate Division is really working across the entire city corporate as well as with the community to get Toronto to net zero. Our target is to do that by 2040. And Toronto, for folks who are not as familiar, is a city of about 3 million people, largest city in Canada. And when we talk about net zero, it's primarily buildings and transportation. And what that really means in kind of practical nature is taking the 470,000 existing buildings and all the new buildings that are going to be going up and are currently going up right now across the city and making those net zero either by retrofits or through how we build better at the beginning. It also means transitioning our entire city fleet, both corporate and community, over either to electric or some sort of active transportation or increasing use of transit. Right now, that's about 1 million cars, single passenger vehicles on the road, plus lots of other types of vehicles. And then also looking at our waste system as well, which makes up a little bit, about 7% of our emissions. So it's a pretty significant activity. We've got 17 years, depending on how you count, to get there. And so not a lot of time, a lot to do. So really it's working with all the divisions across the city who have responsibility and accountability for aspects in terms of emissions. It's working with our partners in the community itself. It's working with our partners at other levels of government. And really it's making sure that we have the right policies, programs, incentives and projects in place to reduce those emissions. And I'd say as it relates to this panel today, before I joined the city, I spent nearly 18 years with the regional government or the province of Ontario, including a few working on climate policy and working very closely with the federal government on a pan-Canadian framework for climate back in 2016, 2017. So I'm able to sit on kind of both sides of the table, both the upper level of government and now at the local municipal level, and get that experience in terms of what's needed and really that significant work that needs to be done to hit the ambition that I think a lot of us share.
Well, you're perfectly aligned to be on this panel as well as to give us some insights, and I think hopefully give people lessons they can learn and put to use in their community. I'm curious, though, it's so interesting to me that different cities have set different benchmarks, 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050. How did you come to 2040, James?
So we did it through modeling.
I see.
We've had various goals over time, and we essentially wanted to be as ambitious but reasonable as possible. So through our modeling, we identified what actions that existed today. So we weren't, betting on innovation in the future coming in to help us, but what actions that existed today could be applied, and if we applied them, could we get to net zero by 2040? And our models show that we can. Now, it doesn't mean that it's easy. Doesn't mean that it's easy. It's going to be a lot of heat pumps. It's going to be a lot of electric vehicles. It's going to be a significant increase in getting people over to transit and using active transportation, whether it's walking and cycling. So it's a significant activity that needs to be done, but we can do it. And our work that we can. So we decided to set our ambition in a place that was possible. Now we just have to do the actions to get to the possible.
That's right. That's right. Well, we'll get to more detail about that, I hope, during this conversation. Are you willing to share your models?
We're actually working in the process now of updating our model, and as part of that, it's going to be open source. So
Excellent.
People have access to the information and be able to use it themselves, and for us, be able to work with our community on changing over time, because we know a model is just a model.
Exactly. Well, part of our mission at Smart Cities World is to share data and share knowledge and learn from each other. So I think that's really, I can't wait to hear more about that. But first, Angel, give us a little bit of detail about your current work and your responsibility and your commitment to addressing the climate crisis through your work.
Well, thank you so much, Sandra. And you and James said a lot of things that were music to my ears, open data, models, and so I love it. So I'm a professor of environmental policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I also founded and direct a research group called the Data Driven EnviroLab. And Sandra, as you mentioned, we're one of the co-leads of the Net Zero Tracker. So we're tracking net zero pledges made by countries, regional governments, cities, as well as companies. And so over the last couple of years, my research group has been trying to apply quantitative data to answer pressing environmental issues like climate change, and often at the intersection of urbanization and other environmental concerns like energy consumption and air pollution. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the climate scientists that contributed to the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 assessment report, specifically Working Group 3, that is trying to understand the state of solutions to try to mitigate impact. And because my work is studying the role of cities and regional governments and private actors interacting with national governments, we were able to incorporate this research into Working Group 3 to really show the state of the science of what we know. Where are cities being effective in their efforts? What are they doing? How much additional mitigation can cities actually contribute on top of what national governments have pledged? So sitting from the modeling perspective and looking at these scenarios, it's really clear that national governments are simply not making the cut when it comes to reducing emissions to the levels that we need in order to keep that elusive 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal within reach. And so the latest report shows that there's a 20 to 23 gigaton gap between current national government policies and where we need those emissions to be to keep that goal within reach. And so we have to look creatively. We have to look to cities and other actors that are, frankly, in many cases, and James, I think exactly that 2040 Toronto goal is actually more ambitious than what the science tells us we need to get to net zero. And that's by 2050. And so the fact that Toronto is 2040, I think is incredible, because you all are ahead of the curve. And that's exactly what we need to happen. We need to have other actors like cities and regional governments step up to the plate and fill in these gaps, because simply national governments are not making the cut. So I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation and happy to dig deeper into the data.
That's fabulous. We talked earlier about being provocative in what we talk about. This is not just a discussion or a panel session to just talk words. We're really interested in calling out the actions that need to be taken. I'm curious, 20 to 23 ton gigaton gap. Right?
Yes.
Can you say in English what that means?
Yeah, sure. Well, right now, average annual emissions are around 55 gigatons. So we basically have to cut that in half. So taking current levels of emissions that are being emitted by countries, by cities, by all of our activities, driving our cars, as James mentioned, living in buildings, consuming food, all of that is putting emissions into the atmosphere. So we basically have to take that number and we have to cut it in half in order to keep that 1.5 goal within reach.
So a little later, we're going to ask you about the specifics needed to do that. But thank you for the work you're doing. Actually, all of you. I mean, holy smoke. We've got to have people that are committed and have this mission to make a difference. I want to move on to a question about what recent actions, if any, your community, your city, your organization has really benefited from any kind of federal government, central government assistance. Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I'm happy to start. and then
Sure, go ahead, James.
So I'll just start maybe with the broad, some examples of the things that we're doing on. So, and a little bit of a plug, we're going to be going to our council, and folks who are familiar, you can find information on our website with our annual report for our first year of our Transform TO Net Zero by 2040 strategy in the coming weeks. We're also going to be launching a carbon budget. One of the first municipalities in North America to do that, working very closely. We've had a lot of support from other municipalities working with C40 in cities and others, and looking at the example of Oslo, really about establishing carbon accountability. But from a specific project perspective, we've been really working on a lot of kind of some of the innovative projects. We have been trying to get net zero buildings. We have a net zero community center up and running, really to be able to demonstrate what can be done and how we can scale that in the community. We've just broken ground, or I should say, a project's just broken ground. The city supports with a company that's actually taking the heat out of sewage that runs past in a main trunk line by one of our major hospitals, and they're using the energy transfer from that heat, same as you would if you were taking it out of water or the air, or geothermal. Just same principles, just using heat that's inherent in the sanitary sewage lines. And actually are going to be reducing the emissions in that large hospital complex by about 80% by transferring that heat over into to energy to use for the heating and cooling of that building. So we've got some really good innovation. Again, though, it's innovation that we need to scale up. In terms of work with the federal government, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the opportunities, we do have a federal government that's very engaged in terms of providing programs. So we've been able to access funding that has moved forward with a 0% home energy loan program. We already had a low interest loan, but now we have a 0% stream. And we're doing a deep retrofit challenge with some commercial buildings and institutional buildings to see if we can drive down emissions even further. Again, these are pretty small in scale. They're in the tens of buildings for the deep retrofits for commercial, and the hundreds for the home energy loan program. And I'll say every bit counts. But when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of buildings, it's we need to think about how we get to scale and how we support that, and the different roles of all the players in that, whether it's higher levels of government, whether it's the local government, and whether it's individuals or industry themselves. There's everyone needs to play a role in terms of that move. But we've had a lot of support and partnerships in various areas with our federal government to take these projects, at least to start and initially.
Well, just as an example, the 0% home energy loan, was that initiated by the federal government in Canada, or was it partly something that came from the bottom up and you all have run with it? How did that actually happen? How could other cities get that kind of support?
A little bit of both. We had a low interest loan, and there was I think a lot of engagement with the federal government on opportunities to look at how we could do more. And the zero interest loan was something that we identified as an opportunity. So we applied to a program to receive funding, and the funding we got was kind of in that range of about $15 million. So part of that is for loans, and part of it was for grants. But we've seen that now grow, and actually our federal government is offering through our Mortgage Housing Corporation, zero interest loans as well. So we're seeing others in the marketplace kind of pick that up and provide that opportunity. Again, there's differences, the amount of money you can borrow, the payback terms. Ours is done actually on title, which is one of the benefits of a municipal approach. So you can attach the title so it moves with the property itself in terms of the improvements that are made to the energy systems. But there's lots of different approaches, but that was an example where we actually were to apply for funds.
Great. And interestingly, going back to your example of pulling heat from sewage systems, I feel like there's so much discovery going on of what we can do with sewage. It's really a credit to some of the young innovators and entrepreneurs that see the value of understanding what that's all about in terms of community activity, but also, pulling energy out of there. Was that also a federally funded and federally initiated program, or where did that come from?
So that project is being supported. I think there was an announcement yesterday related to this. It's a company called Noventa, and it's being supported by a federal entity called the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which provides funding and financing for this type of work to drive down emissions. So we're seeing opportunities in multiple areas from our federal government, and they really have put a lot of emphasis on kind of that innovation and clean technology. And, what is that industrial strategy that's going to help to support the actions in climate that are needed?
Yes, great. Well, I mean, I guess we're seeing all over the world, actually, sort of these innovative ideas that come from the private sector, from individual cities, and through the national governments. That collaboration, those coalitions are, I hope, changing the world. Christina, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more about what's going on in New Bedford, the projects that you're initiating as a city, but also I know you've gotten help from the federal government based on perhaps some of the things that you've asked for. Can you elaborate?
Sure. Probably the area where we've gotten the most support from the federal government is, and this, the benefits of this go beyond the city of New Bedford, but would be the development of offshore wind, with the first, large-scale offshore wind project just deploying right now. Getting started kind of as we speak, utilizing the Marine Commerce Terminal, which is in the south end of our city, which is the first purpose-built wind terminal in the United States. Purpose-built for wind energy deployment, constructed and engineered to withstand those weights. And so that's getting started right now, a project called Vineyard Wind. So, the city had a large role. Mayor likes to talk about New Bedford punching above its weight often. And
right.
Since the inception of his administration in 2012, he prioritized getting wind off the ground, getting offshore wind off the ground, and having New Bedford be the launching point for it and the launching pad for United States offshore wind, at least in the Northeast. So we happen to have a geographic advantage of being, with the one of the windiest places in the world, being about 25 miles offshore from us, or 25 miles offshore from Martha's Vineyard, which is just off the shore from us. And so we have that natural advantage. And then the mayor has leveraged that natural advantage to develop an advantage for economic development and decarbonization for, obviously for our city will benefit from it, but, places far beyond our city. And,
Absolutely.
That has been a process guided by BOEM at the federal level. And it's been a long and arduous, process with all the competing interests that have, reared their heads over the last, decade or more. And finally, these projects are being permitted, and there are more areas being put out for bid in the coming months and years. So this is where, but we'll have the distinction of being the place where it was really launched at a big scale.
That's very exciting. It's so interesting, of all the collaborations, probably the one that hasn't been mentioned enough is collaborating with Mother Nature. So I think the idea being that you're taking advantage of those huge wind shifts in your climate, in your geography, that really advantages the city. But I think even more, perhaps, you're really leveraging collaboration with private sector, public sector, federal government, and state
city
and state government.
Right. Lots of support from our state government. They entirely paid for the construction of the Marine Commerce Terminal. That was several years ago, but since then they keep making additional investments and investments in our port and in the resilience of our port. So that's more on the adaptation front to a degree, but we needed dredging to facilitate these ships that are going to be deploying these, these wind turbines. So they, that was largely a state-funded effort with some federal support as well.
Right.
And, we're looking forward to some of what's in the both the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act around, incentives for it. The one thing I would say is that it's a super complex landscape. And so it is difficult for a city of our size, particularly, to, get the wherewithal to navigate all of that, to do the diving in and the exploration of what's available. Just that act in and of itself, that task in and of itself is daunting, and it takes a lot of resources. So we're working on it, but it's it is a challenge.
Well, and the IIJ, what program did you mention?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the infrastructure. That's the big federal infrastructure act.
Yes.
And then subsequently the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the one that has more direct investments in climate.
Yeah. And
solutions.
Just for our global audience, these are two programs recently funded in the United States to really address climate.
Yes.
Yes. And in a Congress that's pretty divided, I think we could say, without getting too political, that these programs should, in fact, have an impact on the actions that we're going to take to address climate. So we should, I think, as a country, share the ways in which that happened in the United States with other countries that may have different political systems, but certainly
yes.
The need for money from the federal government is really important, I think.
Yes.
Angel, if you'll share a little bit more about what you're seeing in terms of what you're measuring, what you're monitoring, how it could play out in terms of action, new things for people to do that they may be not doing right now, and especially how the national federal government in the United States and maybe around the world that you're familiar with could really inspire action. What are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, these are really great questions. And I just want to draw upon our net zero tracker, which is at the website zerotracker.net. So on the tracker, we have evaluated 247 cities with populations over 250,000. So these are larger cities. So New Bedford, I don't think is actually on the website, but hopefully when we start to expand the data set, we can actually include New Bedford. And so we're looking within different action plans and different strategies that the cities have pledged. What targets they're pledging? Is it, for example, an 80% reduction of their direct emissions, so that would be scope 1, or indirect emissions, scope 2, from purchased electricity, heat, or steam, whether or not they have scope 3 emissions. So this is something I wanted to ask James, if Toronto in these net zero targets for 2040 are thinking about scope 3 or out of boundary emissions. And these are incredibly critical. So our research has found where we do have the scope 3 data, so supply chain or consumption based emissions, that these can comprise as much as 2/3 to 75% of a city's overall carbon footprint. But unfortunately, many cities are not accounting for these scope 3 emissions. They're not necessarily including these emissions in their targets, particularly for net zero. And so net zero, this is a pretty, I think, complex concept as well. And so when we say net zero, we mean the amount of emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere have to be balanced by an equal amount that's being taken out. And so recognizing it from the scientific and the modeling perspective that it's really difficult for cities to get all the way to zero emissions. I mean, there are some sectors that like iron and steel and cement, for example, where it might be really difficult to actually get to zero emissions. So we may have to offset through increasing natural sinks of carbon within cities. So increasing forest cover and grasses. And I mean, there's been now some innovation. Some cities are experimenting with types of cement and concrete that can actually take in and absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so a lot of these strategies that are now being considered and being put on the table to help cities get to net zero. But I think this is one area on our tracker we can see a major gap where a lot of cities are not considering these consumption or out of boundary based emissions. So that would be one thing that we're seeing in terms of the trends. And so I'd love to hear from James how, and also Christina, how both of your cities are really thinking about scope 3 emissions, because I think this also calls it calls for the need to coordinate more with other cities, other levels of government, the state level, and then also national. And I mean, unfortunately, now cities are part of a global network of supply chains and consumption patterns, and so it's just becoming even more complex. So I mean, it's good to hear, James, the strategy of Toronto to focus on buildings and transport, but then also, I'm thinking, oh gosh, looking at the bigger landscape, that's one of the major gaps. And we've done text analyses, machine learning, so systematically looked at thousands of these cities' action plans, and that was one area that was a notable gap.
Yeah.
Christina, speak to that if you can, and James next.
Oh, sure. I'll be honest with you that it's not in our our NB Resilient plan. And now you've motivated me to really take a look at it and to probably do an amendment to account for it. So thank you for that. But yeah, I guess that's one of those areas where, especially a small city like ours, I mean, what can we really do? I suppose like purchasing co-ops or something like that, as you said,
That's right.
Collaboration with other municipalities and with the state to try to buy products to the greatest extent possible that, that aren't contributing. But, we were talking about steel and concrete. There's, there aren't really substitutes for that, except, you did mention this experimental cement, which I'm interested in exploring. But so therefore, I guess it's offsetting, like, as you said. We are a relatively built out city, so you don't see a lot of cranes in the air building skyscrapers. In New Bedford, you see cranes on our waterfront right now building port infrastructure. But so to that extent, we're not, we don't do a lot of new construction here. We are relatively built out, and we have a giant wetland that takes up a good chunk of our land mass that, will never be developed. And, we are working on our urban tree canopy very actively. It's one of the mayor's big priorities is planting trees. And, we think of that as a stormwater strategy as well, a flooding mitigation strategy. But, that's an area where I suppose we could use, more help from levels of government above us. There is a state program that does a little bit for cities like ours to develop their urban tree canopy, but it doesn't seem to be a lot of federal support for that, for reforestation and urban forestation. So that might be an area to really look at. But I guess it's a daunting challenge, to realize that what you're buying to build what you need to build, or repair what you need to repair is adding to, is adding to the problem while you're actively trying to mitigate it through what's within your direct control. So it's a tough one. But I appreciate you bringing it to our attention.
James, your response to Angel's thoughts?
Yeah. I would say for Toronto, our plan is focused on scope 1 and 2. That being said, we've recognized that scope 3 is an area that we need to do more work in. So we're actually going to be bringing forward a consumption-based inventory later this year, I believe, that looks into scope 3 and will help us guide in terms of actions we can take to reduce our emissions, and whether that's in our infrastructure, purchasing, the activities we're taking, whether it's in areas like food. We know there's lots of opportunities. We know it's challenging, but I think just understanding what and how great those emissions are will be incredibly important, because then it'll enable us to take the actions we can, building off our direct emissions that we have, and those through kind of the electricity side as well. And so that's part of our work. But it is something that we kind of recognized and maybe a bit different than New Bedford. We're built out, but we're building up. We've got a lot of cranes, and when coming through Toronto, we'll see a lot of cranes building significant housing, and that's going to continue on because we've got a housing supply challenge. So there's a lot of development. There's a lot of infrastructure work, whether it's new infrastructure. We have big investments coming forward through our provincial government and partnering on transit investments and new subways, and whether it's state of good repair and building out the infrastructure we currently have. And in some cases, making sure it's resilient to a changing climate. We know that there's going to be a lot of embedded emissions in that work. So part of what we're doing is understanding that, and then what actions can we take? What actions do we need others to take, whether it's at a higher level of government or in industry, and how can we start to account for it and understand how it contributes to the overall challenges that we have.
That's great. It's so interesting. I wonder, I think our audience today and over the next 2 days is very engaged in the climate challenge. And I think there's certain levels of engagement based on where you live and, what your role or responsibility might be for your actual job. But I wonder, Angel, how many people really understand the difference? If you're in the industry, you may, but if you're just sort of on the planet and sort of engaged or interested, how many people really understand what Scope 3 emissions are? Secondly, I'd like you to address that. Yeah. And secondly, the experimental concrete is one example of where I think there's not enough sharing going on. So, do people even know about these new ideas? And how can Net Zero Tracker be also a communicator for, these new innovations, the new ideas that people can adopt in their everyday life?
Absolutely. Really great questions. And I'm glad you asked about the emission scope because this used to be my job. My first job out of grad school, I was working at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative at the World Resources Institute. So we developed the accounting tools, the protocols and methodologies to help organizations, governments, and businesses to measure and account for their greenhouse gas emissions. And so by scope 1, we mean direct emissions that are resulting from emission sources within the direct boundary. And there are different ways that you can define that boundary. And so that's normally coming from boilers, furnaces, if you are combusting any type of fuel, if you own fleet vehicles and they're combusting fuel, all of those would account in your direct emissions. So that's scope 1. Scope 2 then are your indirect emissions. And so if you are purchasing electricity, heat, or steam that's outside of your boundary, but it's being imported and transmitted in, then that's your indirect emissions. Scope 3 is much fuzzier because that's all of the other emissions that don't fall into the purchase electricity and your direct emissions. So these can come anywhere up the supply chain. So exactly as Christina was saying, if they're building and you're bringing in steel and concrete that's produced somewhere else, then those emissions, and generally we refer to those as embodied emissions, those would count as your scope 3 emissions because those emissions are being generated as a result of your purchasing. And so that's exactly why cities now are talking about green procurement and green purchasing policies to make sure that they're accounting for those particular emissions in their purchasing decisions. And then it can also include downstream emissions as well. So this is a huge issue for oil and gas companies that are also pledging net zero, which frankly, in my opinion, are not necessarily very credible if they're not including scope 3 emissions, because that's the use phase of their products, their petroleum and their oil products. And so Shell, for example, is being sued in the Netherlands because they've claimed to go net zero, but then a deeper look at their pledge, and they are not including the majority of their emissions generated, which is in this scope 3 category in the product end use. And so a lot of car manufacturers, it's the same thing. Most of the emissions are not coming when they're producing the car itself, but rather when we're driving them around through the lifetime of the vehicle. So it's incredibly tricky, but yes, I think incredibly important because it allows for us to disentangle where are the emissions coming from. And exactly as James says, it helps cities identify categories where they could save emissions and really be credible in their net zero targets. Because if everyone's, ideally, if everyone is reducing their scope 1 emissions and getting all the way to zero, and all of our electricity is purchased from clean energy sources, then we should be able to hit those benchmarks. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And that's why the accounting is really messy and why it's important for us to get those balance sheets of carbon and tons of carbon right so that we can identify within the supply chain, oh, maybe there are green suppliers that are doing things to reduce their emissions that could help a city actually be more credible in their net zero targets.
Great. Well, I'm wondering, thank you so much for calling out Shell, among others that we could probably call out. I think perhaps there's just not enough of that going on. We talk about greenwashing and, net zero, meaning, wait a minute, so much in, so much out. Is that really helping the planet? It's sort of like we're still emitting, we're just covering it, if you will. So Angel, talk a little bit about the reality of that, especially as it applies to the corporate world as well as federal governments.
Well, that's right. And I think that's a huge issue, what you've called out, which is greenwashing. And so the UN has recognized this. So in the lead up to the 2015 Paris climate negotiations, it was every cities, right, and let's get the companies, let's get the CEOs on board so we can support the most ambitious global goal. And now that we've got there, it's kind of a pump the brakes situation where we're starting to look at the various pledges, my group included in the net zero tracker. And we're saying, actually, this is not really that credible. There are a lot of holes. There's a lot of questionable commitments that are being made. And so the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, 2 years ago at the COP26 negotiations in in Glasgow, he said the same thing. We need to prevent greenwashing, and he convened this high-level panel to develop better standards and requirements for different companies and cities as they pledge these net zero targets. And so that's a lot of what our net zero tracker is trying to support. We're trying to provide transparency and shine a light on what different companies and cities are doing. And Christina brought up the question of offsets. And I think that in a lot of cases, that's the only way for a lot of these various entities to try to get to net zero. But frankly, a lot of them are not credible either, especially land-based, forest-based offsets. But many of them are based in the United States and California, which has regularly been experiencing wildfires. And so if you think about if people are buying those carbon credits, thinking that those forests are going to be there, next year a fire comes, wipes them out, immediately, then you're back to square one. You're not really then achieving your net zero offset of emissions that you're putting up. So it is. I think we're entering this phase of needing more accountability. And so I think as cities, the easy part is pledging, but then it's how do I actually make this really robust and credible? And what, our opinion, or my opinion, at least in this work, is that we have to really account for and measure the scope 3 emissions to at least know what the impact is, and then do everything we can to work with those various suppliers and other actors within that scope 3 category to reduce those emissions as well. And I forgot to answer your other question about, sharing these stories. And I think that's what we need to do more of. And so it's so great that Smart Cities World is having this conversation the next couple of days, because that's exactly what we need to do. We need to share these examples and these potential areas of innovation that we can all benefit from.
Right. And I think, start spreading the news is sort of one of our missions in general. It's how we learn from each other and how we can help each other. But I do think the idea that that what we're saying, what we're committing to doing regarding smart city, Marty, regarding emissions is not necessarily what the reality is. So we just have a few minutes left, but I do want to ask one question of each of you, because I think, actually, I'd like to put each of you in this job. So if you could be the king or the queen or the president or the emir of your country or your organization, really, what 2 or 3 recommendations would you make? What specifics would you make for us, collaboratively as well? I mean, as a city, but also as a community, if you will. What recommendations would you make? What actions should we be taking that we could sort of open up some new ideas, open up some windows, perhaps, to more transparency? Christina, can we start with you?
Sure. So I feel a little out of my depth to answer this question, but one thing I would say, I alluded earlier to the complexity of the funding and the supports that are available at the municipal level. It being a great navigation challenge and just a real capacity problem. So one thing that just occurred to me was, we have something in the United States called the Community Development Block Grant. And that over time, those funds have diminished, unfortunately, to a point where they're of use, but it could, they could be more robust. They just started.
They could be reinstated, perhaps. I mean, it's sort of like they've fallen out of favor almost, right?
Well, we have them,
right?
But they've, we get less now, like in real dollars, not in inflation adjusted dollars. We get fewer now than we did when the program was getting up and running in the late 70s. So like a lot less. So, and they, so they've instituted the energy services block grant program. So this is like, again, a formula funded program at the federal level. I think the formula has us getting like $147,000 or something like that. So, what can we really do with that?
Right.
So, but there's all these funds out there that are competitive. So you have to, again, you have to dig in to this complex of programs and regulations and what they call NOFOs, Notice of Funding Opportunities at the federal level, and figure out what's out there and whether you qualify for it or not. It's just really complex. And then there are all these additional, Ezra Klein calls it the everything bagel liberalism. So you pile on all of these other like good things that you want to support and do around like, say, supplier diversity, just as an example. But if the most urgent thing is to reduce to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to reduce carbon, then could we not think about maybe just really prioritizing that in a way that, just gets the money to where it needs to be just more quickly with less friction? And so that is one thing, like more of like formula funding or more kind of like flexible funding. Not endlessly flexible. You have to do, the things with it that are, for its purpose, like community development block grants, but maybe just, some more, less effort going into the obtaining of the funds, so that you can really put your effort into spending them in the right ways. So that would be one thing I'd say, at the federal level.
Great recommendation. James, give us your take on all that. What's if you could be king? I'm assuming you'd be king of the country of Canada. Let's hear it. What would you do?
I'm going to start by agreeing wholeheartedly with what Christina said. Our modeling, again, it's a model, so give or take $100 billion, but our model shows that there's I'll call it $145 billion opportunity in the getting to the city of Toronto to net zero. So those are investments that are needed, whether they're in retrofits, in vehicles, in infrastructure. But that's significant. That's investments that are going to be needed by all levels of government, residents, businesses, the private sector. But we know government's going to play a role, and some of that funding is going to need to come from those higher levels of government. And it's going to be significant. And having that, as Christina said, that certain, that sustainable funding that is accessible and not little bits of money here and there that require massive amounts of work to apply for and then administer is going to be really important. Just looking at the scale of what we're trying to achieve across all the countries that are making these significant pledges to action. There's big changes that are going to happen in industry, but there's lots of small changes that are going to happen as well at the individual level, and how we actually can support that is going to be critical to how people live their lives, how they heat their buildings, the transportation choices they make. And I think having that sustainable, certain long-term funding is incredibly important. On top of that, maybe a couple other things I would say for municipalities. Strategies are important. Plans are incredibly important, and sometimes we get criticized. We do too much planning, not enough action. But we're in it's a 17-year for us. 17-year marathon. We need to be planning for that in terms of what we need to do. This is a significant scale, and really planning in terms of what those costs are, how we implement it. And that's going to be incredibly important. The eyes are going to be on all of these investments, making sure they're being done right, that we're getting value for money, and that we're supporting the outcomes. So there is going to be some upfront work needed. Action's important, but the plans are important as well to make sure that action is sustainable and that it occurs over the time period. And then lastly, I would say focus on communications. At the end of the day, a lot of what we need to do is going to be about communications. This, in a large number of the cases, the solutions are there. For us, it's in buildings and transportation. So this, use of heat pumps, air source heat pumps, to heat homes and to provide cooling is a significant solution for residential users. Use of transit, choices around cycling, but a lot of that comes down to communication, letting people understand the options they have, how they can navigate making changes, how they can navigate making those investments. And a lot of that's going to be communications. And I think government plays a key role there because, we can play a trusted role in terms of helping people with the choices and understanding the importance of those choices they're making. So I would say communications is something just to focus on and to think about.
I love that suggestion. I've been a fan of that for many years. And I think tied into that, James, is also this idea of building trust. In other words, can we trust the government to do what they say they will do? Can we trust the private sector to honor their commitments? Can we trust each other to not water our lawns so frequently, or to, figure out what we're doing with plastic waste and recyclables? I think there's a huge element of communicating the reality and perhaps even calling out situations, as you've done, Angel, to really show what the reality is versus what we hope it will be. But I love that communications idea. We don't do enough of that, in my opinion, across the board. So, Angel, what are your ideas about if you were queen of the United States? I don't think the U.S. has queens, but queens in political situations. But if you were the lead across the U.S. government, what would you recommend? Or pick another country since you're involved globally.
Well, I guess in this hypothetical kingdom that I'm a queen of, I want to just thank Christina and James for all of their hard work, because they really do have the tough job. I'm just the researcher who it's easy for me to just look at the data and collect the information and make these criticisms. But I know that the work that really matters is the work that they're doing where the rubber meets the road and really the boots on the ground. So I just want to thank them for their work. I would say two things. One would be try as much as possible to get your governments to make pledges and actions in the short term. So looking at the data, looking at the pledges on the net zero tracker, looking at those net zero goals, most of the cities have pledged to do something in the 2041 to 2050 time period. And as James said, that's 17, 18, 20 years, 30 years away. That's a really long time away. And we know that particularly in the United States, political cycles are on a much shorter cycle. And so, we lived through it where all of a sudden we were part of the Paris Agreement and then the next day we were not. And so it's very easy for different political leaders based on their agenda to reverse these actions. So I would say as much as possible, try to get near-term actions so that we can try to close that window and to reduce emissions as quickly as possible, because that's the only way all of us are going to have a chance to avoid the most dangerous effects of climate change. Secondly, and this is very much to James's points about supporting individuals. In the IPCC, we introduced a new chapter in Working Group 3 on demand-side responses. To me, this was the most hope in a lot of very dark IPCC climate scientific literature. And so what we found is that when individuals do things exactly as James said, we retrofit our homes, we have heat pumps. I just got an induction stove and an e-bike so that I can reduce the amount that I drive, take public transit. We can actually reduce across these various sectors emissions by another 40 to 70%. To me, that's huge. And that demonstrates the ability and the power of us as individuals working with our local governments to try to really reduce emissions. And so I think that that's part of the story that's often lost. And I teach young people, and they have climate anxiety and eco anxiety, and they feel like they can't do anything. But I think this is also a charge for local governments and state and also national governments. Think about how you can better incentivize individuals to take advantage of all of these opportunities to live a lower or zero carbon lifestyle. And that's exactly what we're doing in the United States right now with the Inflation Reduction Act. For decades, policymakers were getting it wrong. They were saying we need more sticks. And then the light bulb went off and said, well, let's try the carrots, because the sticks obviously haven't been working. And that's been revolutionary so far. And I feel a lot of energy, particularly where I live in the Raleigh-Durham area. Local governments are super excited. They're coming, they're asking me, what should we do? What kind of money should we ask for? And so I see that there's a lot of potential. But yeah, those two things I would focus on: near-term action and then incentivizing carrots.
Perfect way to end this session. And I want to thank each of you for joining us. I think whether you're doing research or actually working within a city or a community, I mean, that's what's happening in the world. One of the things that you mentioned about working with young people and getting them excited as well. I mean, I think they are our future. And if we can communicate more to them and engage with them, I think it'll be a better outcome in terms of accountability, transparency, building trust. We've got all of that ahead of us. What I'd like to do is in about a year, when we have another summit, is to invite each of you to come back and talk about the progress you've made. And again, where you see the gaps and where you see the gaps being filled. It'll be really fun to check on your progress, especially. Luke, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And I'm going to, again, thank you all for joining us for this really, really fun and interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a really inspiring conversation there. So thank you, Sandra, for leading on that, and thank you to Christina, Angel, and James as well for your time and your insight. It really has been an eye opener to get this understanding of how cities have been working through different projects and programs with central and regional government, and the different avenues that support has come through as well. I think what's really important is that what we've heard throughout the day is that there is this funding gap for climate action. And what we can actually take from this session is that there are models and there are programs, particularly from central governments in North America, that can at least begin to fill that gap, push these projects forward, not take a lead on it, but take a lead from cities and take that lead in a way that is more place-based than we've had before, so that what comes from those programs is going to really benefit the communities in those cities and the people that actually live, work, and enjoy those spaces. And that's critical. But at the same time, we've got these challenges that remain as well. Cities typically are pretty risk averse. That is changing. So, where to spend, how to go through these processes, where and how to mitigate that kind of risk in terms of investment decisions, and how to peel back the layers of what this journey is going to be in each individual instance, to really make sure that people can get to grips with it and follow it thoroughly. It's been absolutely fantastic. So I can only thank you all for your time and the insight you've given us. And unfortunately, that's the last session that we have for day one of the City Climate Action Summit. We have been online since 9:30 a.m. UK time, and really it's been an amazing first day. I'm going to try and summarize it as best I can. There's been an awful lot to take in, so bear with me. We started out with our keynote with UNDRR, which really gave us a reminder of what is at stake during the climate crisis, and the necessity for this all of society approach and solution. And that's been echoed throughout the day, as has the need for less short-term thinking and more long-term strategic thinking over time. And this reminder as well that change is incremental. Cities have become more willing to take that risk, as I just said, push things forward and be more agile. That process isn't finished yet. At the heart of that, as James has rightly referenced in closing just a moment ago, the heart of all of this is in the plans and the targets that have been set and established. And we've reached that tipping point now where those can't be pushed any further out. And now cities are somewhere between this marathon and a sprint for those who have goals for 2040, a bit more of a marathon. For 2030, definitely a sprint. We're only 6.5 years away. It's a case of trying to achieve those goals, but do so with that long-term future in mind. So past those dates, it's not like you hit that goal and then it's finished. You have to continue that work. And with that long-term future in mind, it's not just this generation, but future generations, because it has been short-sightedness that has led us to where we are, and the reason that we have these conversations, have had these conversations all day, and will continue to do so over the next couple of days as well. It's no small challenge, but I think throughout the day we've learned a bit more about the scale of action that's required, the finance that's needed, as we've just been speaking about, the type of integrated approach across cities, across federal, regional, state governments, and the role of technology within that as well. It's one thing to be connected, but are you connected digitally? Are you also connected across teams, across departments, across different public services, and across public and private sectors as well? It's that collaboration across all sectors moving forward that is really going to define whether these targets are met or not. And revisiting one of our earlier panels as well, what has come through really clearly is how much this work centers on people and their experience in living in cities, working in cities, enjoying those spaces as they have every right to do. And that has been really put back into focus today for me, as it has been in all of the conversations that I've had with city practitioners and city leaders over the last year, probably since we started to come out of that of the pandemic. What that process did, for all the negative it brought, is it has refocused the mind in a lot of areas, and climate is really no different. We have so much more to come. And that's just a summary of the first day. So I would implore everybody watching to stay tuned with us on Thursday for our next virtual day. We are live in London tomorrow. If you're local and you would like to try and come along, feel free to register. We'll see if we can have you in the room with us. For everything that has gone before, you'll be able to watch it all on demand at your leisure. We've got some brilliant partners, exhibitors, sponsors, all-round collaborators with us for the rest of the summit as well. They're still going to be around after the event today to take your meetings, answer your questions. I encourage everybody to go and find out more about the work they're doing and the solutions that they can provide as well. And the one thing that we always say at the end of these conversations and the end of these sessions is that it's really key to keep the conversation moving, to keep things, keep that conversation flowing, to really uncover some next steps, some things that you didn't know, and use the most of the opportunity to ask people exactly what you want to ask them. Get the questions answered that you need answered. And hopefully we can continue doing that over the next few days. So I want to thank you all very much for joining us. Thank our last panel there as well for all of their time and for listening to me waffle on at the end as well. Thank you for your patience. And we will see you on Thursday, if not before, in London. Thank you all very much.